On February 12, 2025, the world witnessed a shocking event. US President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin announced the start of peace talks about Ukraine without the European Union or Ukraine itself. This announcement came after a phone call between the two leaders where they agreed that discussions would begin right away. This move not only surprised the EU and Ukraine, but also put them in a tough spot. Being left out of the talks showed a decline in the EU's influence in European security matters, and raised questions about Ukraine's future in this new geopolitical landscape. Right after the announcement, European leaders held emergency meetings to discuss the situation. French President Emmanuel Macron led a meeting with EU leaders in Paris, where they expressed their worries about being excluded from these important talks. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz stressed the need for the EU to be involved in the negotiation process to resolve the conflict in Ukraine. He insisted that Europe would not accept an agreement made without its participation. Josep Borrell, the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, also condemned the talks between Trump and Putin, saying that any agreement concerning Ukraine must include Europe. For Ukraine, being left out of the talks about its own future was a huge shock. President Volodymyr Zelensky expressed disappointment and concern about the lack of consultation from the United States before holding talks with Russia. President Trump's decision to talk directly with Russia without the EU at the table could be part of a new geopolitical strategy for the United States. The goal might be to separate Russia from China's influence and change the global balance of power. European leaders called a special meeting on March 6 to talk about the situation in Ukraine and Europe's defense strategy. This could be the first step in redefining the EU's role on the world stage and making sure Europe's voice is heard on important issues. Throughout the 3 years of conflict in Ukraine, the European Union has played a key role in providing military and financial support to Kiev. With billions of euros poured into the war, the EU hopes to have a decisive say in shaping Ukraine's future. However, when US President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin shook hands on peace negotiations without the EU's involvement, Europe suddenly became a bystander in this important geopolitical game. Since the conflict erupted in 2022, the EU has committed to providing Ukraine with around 48.5 billion euros in military aid. The aid packages include weapons, ammunition, and military equipment to help Kyiv counter Russian forces. In February 2025, the EU proposed increasing support by asking each member country to contribute financially based on the size of their economy, with the goal of providing an additional 1.5 million artillery rounds and other defense systems this year. In addition to military aid, the EU also provides financial and humanitarian support to Ukraine. These support packages aim to help Ukraine maintain government operations, rebuild destroyed infrastructure, and support people affected by the war. In total, the EU has provided tens of billions of euros in financial and humanitarian aid to Ukraine since 2022. With their huge financial and military contributions, the EU expects to have a significant say in shaping Ukraine's future after the conflict. European leaders want to make sure that Ukraine continues on the path of European integration, implementing democratic and economic reforms that meet EU standards. They also hope that their support will help strengthen regional security and prevent further Russian expansion. When President Trump and President Putin announced the start of peace talks about Ukraine without EU involvement, European leaders were shocked. Being sidelined on an issue they had invested so much in, both financially and politically, was a major blow to the EU's credibility and influence on the world stage.
Check, check, check one, check two, check, check.
European Council President Antonio Costa stressed that the EU needs to be involved in negotiations with Russia regarding the conflict in Ukraine and build a new security structure, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz also affirmed that Europe will not accept an agreement made without its participation. However, despite these strong statements, the reality is that the EU has been excluded from the important negotiations. Throughout the conflict, the EU has acted like a merchant of death, constantly supplying weapons and military support to Ukraine. Member countries have sent tons of weapons, from rifles and ammunition to advanced air defense systems, to help Kyiv fight against Russian forces. This is not only to support Ukraine but also to protect Europe's own security interests. Supplying weapons to Ukraine also benefits European countries economically, especially those with developed defense industries. Arms manufacturing and export contracts have created jobs and boosted economic growth. Politically, supporting Ukraine helps the EU strengthen its role as a defender of democratic values and human rights around the world. Even though the EU has invested a lot in Ukraine, they've been left out of important talks between the United States and Russia. This means Europe doesn't have a say in shaping Ukraine's future and can't protect its interests in the region. This disappointment grows as European leaders realize their efforts and investments might be wasted. Being excluded from these talks isn't just a diplomatic failure. It also risks the EU losing influence in the region. If the US and Russia reach an agreement without Europe's involvement, the EU could be overlooked in regional security and political matters, impacting its reputation and standing on the world stage. Volodymyr Zelensky, a famous comedian, entered Ukrainian politics with hopes of bringing change and reform. However, his journey from the presidential palace to the possibility of facing prison is a dramatic and ironic story. Zelensky is well known for his role in the television series Servant of the People, where he played a teacher who unexpectedly becomes president. His acting career earned him public adoration, and he decided to shift to politics, forming the Servant of the People Party and winning the presidency by a landslide in 2019. When he first took office, Zelensky was expected to bring change and fight corruption. His approval rating soared to 90% in the first few months as the conflict with Russia erupted in February 2022. However, the challenges of the war and pressure from both inside and outside the country quickly eroded this support. Over time, Zelensky's approval rating began to decline. In May 2023, Ukrainians' trust in him fell below 60% for the first time since the war began. By February 2025, a survey by the political sociology firm Sosis showed that his approval rating was only around 16%. And among those voters who had decided and planned to vote, this number rose to 22%. This shows a growing loss of confidence from the public towards their leader. US President Donald Trump publicly criticized Zelensky, calling him a dictator without elections, and claiming that his approval rating was only at 4%. Even though polls showed higher actual support, these statements put more pressure on Zelensky. Also, Trump pushed Ukraine to hold early elections, especially if Kiev reached a ceasefire agreement with Russia in the next few months. However, Ukraine's constitution forbids holding elections during martial law, so for elections to happen, martial law must be lifted. With decreasing support and increasing pressure, Zelensky is facing the risk of losing his position in the upcoming election. There are even worries that he might face legal charges after leaving office, especially if his political rivals come to power. In this situation, Zelensky announced that he was willing to resign in exchange for peace and NATO membership for Ukraine. Ukraine, a country with a rich history and deep ties to Russia, has gone through many changes in its journey to find its identity and place on the world stage. However, in recent years, Ukraine's political choices and foreign policy seem to have led to a forgetting of its roots and history, causing serious consequences for the country and its people. The relationship between Ukraine and Russia goes back to the time of Kievan Rusis in the 9th century. an East Slavic state centered in Kiev. This is considered the cultural and religious cradle of both nations. After the fall of Kiev and Rus' due to the Mongol invasion in the 13th century, the center of power gradually shifted north, leading to the formation of the Grand Duchy of Moscow, the forerunner of modern Russia. For centuries, Ukraine was ruled by different empires, but its cultural, linguistic, and religious ties with Russia remained. In the 20th century, after the October Revolution, Ukraine became one of the republics of the Soviet Union. During this period, the Soviet Union invested heavily in Ukraine's industry and infrastructure, making it an important industrial center. Under Soviet rule, Ukraine received significant economic and military support. Factories, infrastructure, and the education system were greatly developed. After the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Russia continued to maintain a close relationship with Ukraine, providing energy at discounted prices and economic support in many areas. However, this relationship wasn't always smooth. Disputes over gas prices, borders, and foreign policy created tensions between the two countries. Even so, the historical and cultural connections remained an important factor in their relationship. At the beginning of the 21st century, some Ukrainian leaders and citizens started looking towards the West, hoping to join the European Union and NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The promises of joining NATO were seen as a chance for Ukraine to escape Russia's influence and move towards a brighter future. However, this goal caused deep divisions within Ukrainian society. Part of the population, especially in the east and south, felt close ties to Russia and worried about leaving their historical roots. On the other hand, the western and central regions strongly supported joining the West. Focusing on joining NATO and the EU led Ukraine to gradually forget its historical relationship with Russia. The Ukrainian government implemented many policies to reduce Russia's influence, including limiting the use of the Russian language in education and media, as well as removing symbols related to the Soviet Union. These policies not only caused discontent among some of the population, but also increased tension with Russia. Forgetting shared roots in history has created a growing gap between the two countries, leading to conflict and instability in the region. The consequence of forgetting their origins and chasing promises from the West has led to tragedies for Ukraine. The conflict with Russia that exploded in 2022 caused heavy losses in lives and property. Hundreds of thousands of people died, infrastructure was destroyed, and the economy fell into crisis. Even with help from Western countries, Ukraine still faces many challenges. Joining NATO is still a distant dream, while the relationship with Russia is getting worse. Ukrainian people are suffering the consequences of political decisions that seem to have forgotten their roots and history. The conflict in Ukraine has reached a critical turning point, with US President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin shaking hands and cutting the EU out of the negotiations, while President Volodymyr Zelensky faces the threat of being overthrown and even imprisoned. This isn't just an ordinary war, it's a historical tragedy for a nation led astray by Western promises, forgetting its origins and roots. A harsh truth that the EU and Ukraine must accept is that Trump and Putin are the ones truly in control, while the EU, despite spending hundreds of billions of euros on this war, is sidelined without any worthwhile reward. Over 2 years ago, the EU excitedly jumped into the war, believing they would be at the center of a new world order. They provided weapons, ammunition, and financial aid to Ukraine, hoping that after a victory, they would have a share in the reconstruction process and capture the lucrative market of a pro-Western Ukraine. But in the end, it was the United States, the one who kept pushing the EU to pour more money and weapons into the war, that sat down with Russia to settle the Ukraine issue without even consulting Europe. This event not only marks the complete strategic failure of the EU, but also shows that they have never truly been an independent geopolitical power. They are just pawns on a chessboard arranged by Washington, ready to be sacrificed to serve American interests. The bitter lesson the EU learned from the war in Ukraine is this: war isn't a charity, it's a brutal business. Over the past 2 years, the EU has spent hundreds of billions of euros providing weapons and financial aid to Ukraine. They did this not just for moral reasons, but also because they believed a pro-Western Ukraine would benefit the EU in the long run. They hoped that after a victory, European companies would have the opportunity to invest in Ukraine's markets, control its resources, fertile land, and its strategic location. But what they didn't expect was the US and Russia quickly dividing the spoils, leaving Europe out in the cold. Washington will profit from reconstruction contracts, from arms sales, and from ensuring that Europe remains dependent on them for security. Russia gets important territories, protects its strategic interests, and ends the threat from NATO right on its border. And the EU, they are left with a mountain of debt, a weakened economy, an unstable energy supply, and a domestic political crisis for pursuing a pointless war. With the Ukrainian elections just around the corner, Zelensky's approval rating has plummeted to below 10%. Once hailed as a symbol of democracy, he's now a leader abandoned by both his own people and the international community. In the final days of his term, Zelensky is probably thinking more about an exit strategy than leading his country. Trump's pressure on Ukraine to hold early elections means Zelensky has no way to postpone his downfall. Once the election takes place, he's almost certain to lose, and then it's only a matter of time before he's behind bars. This is a humiliating downfall for a leader once praised by the West. But really, Zelensky's fate is no different from other political puppets the US has propped up and then discarded, kept around as long as they're useful, and tossed aside when they're not. The saddest part of this story isn't the EU's failure or Zelensky's downfall, but the tragic fate of Ukraine and its people. Over 2 years ago, Ukraine faced a historic choice: to maintain its traditional relationship with Russia, or to chase the West's promises of a future in NATO and the EU. They chose the second path but didn't realize it was a dead end. They forgot that Russia wasn't just a neighbor, it was a big part of Ukraine's history and culture. The Soviet Union, which is now Russia, invested a lot in Ukraine. They built roads and buildings, helped the economy grow, and protected the country for many years. NATO and the EU never really wanted Ukraine to be an equal member. They just wanted Ukraine as a buffer zone, a forward base against Russia, a place to test weapons, and a stepping stone to weaken Moscow. But the Ukrainian people were led astray by powerful propaganda. They were made to believe that Russia was the enemy, that the West was a trustworthy friend, and that simply joining NATO and the EU would solve all the country's problems. What was the result? A devastated country, a collapsed economy, millions of people forced to leave their homes. Hundreds of thousands of young Ukrainians died on the battlefield for a war they never had a chance of winning. The future of the country is not decided by its own people, but lies in the hands of outside forces. Ukraine is no longer a truly independent nation. It's a puppet on strings. They've lost not only land but also their identity, their history, and the chance to reconcile with their own roots. Ukraine's story is a bitter lesson about wrong choices and the consequences of losing your way. The EU has learned that they're just working for America, with no say in their own future. Zelensky has learned that being a puppet of the West means that when you're no longer useful, there's only one path left. The Ukrainian people have learned that believing in empty promises can destroy an entire nation, and the world has learned the most important lesson of all. There's no room for naivety in international politics. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe for more videos. See you next time.